Hi friends, welcome back for chapter 3 of Flat Stanley. I hope that you're able to take Flat Miss K on a great adventure today. So the title of chapter 3 is Stanley the Kite. Do we have any predictions about what might happen in this chapter? Tell a grown-up or tell the screen. All right, let's read to find out. So remember that we need to be able to visualize or make a movie in our mind since this is a chapter book. Here we go. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you've bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose." "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley asked. "Nice to meet you, young fellow," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the encyclopedia on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there, help me." What is Arthur trying to do? It sounds like he's trying to get flat like Stanley. How do you think Arthur is feeling right now? I think he's feeling a little angry. Maybe a little jealous of Stanley because Stanley is getting to do all of these new things and Stanley isn't having to walk in crowds. What are some clues from the story that tell us how Arthur is feeling? Is there anything that he did that might show us that he is angry? Maybe anything that he said to show us that he's feeling angry? Tell a grown-up what you think. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous just like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. What do you think Stanley's idea is? "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, up, up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise and let it take him when he wanted to speed. He only had to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully a little at a time so that it didn't hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. So that's something else that Flat Stanley was able to do. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again towards the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it all about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Flat Stanley didn't realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Poor Stanley. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening. So how do we think Stanley's feeling? Well, why wouldn't he want to talk to his brother? What did Arthur do? And even at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still angry. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." That's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is titled The Museum Thieves. I wonder what's going to happen at the museum and what that has to do with Flat Stanley. Okay, can't wait to see what adventure you take me on today, friends. Can't wait to see you back again for chapter 4.